let's get started. My name is Ann Dolin, and for the last 27 years, we've not only been helping kids to prep for the SAT and ACT, but also to develop a strategic plan for testing and all that comes with college admissions as well. Today, we're talking specifically about navigating the SAT and ACT in 2025 because it's different now than it was even just 6 months ago. So fortunately, I've got an expert in the house with me today. Please meet Pete Pecoraro. Pete, welcome. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you for having me back, especially in the midst of so much change.
Yes, there certainly is a lot of change. So a bit about Pete, he's a test prep tutor here with me at Educational Connections. And not only that, he's our professional development specialist, meaning that he always is staying abreast with content changes to these tests, and he runs workshops for our tutors here. He's a former high school teacher. He has a teaching degree from the University of Illinois, and for 11 years, he's been helping kids to prep for the SAT and ACT. So Pete, let's start out with the changes that we're seeing. You know, just a few weeks ago, Ohio State mentioned that they're going to require tests, students to submit scores for the SAT or the ACT. Tell us a little bit about what's going on right now.
This is definitely becoming the dominant trend. I mean, and it's hitting the headlines regularly, mainstream media, not even just like folks in education like ourselves, but the mainstream newspapers, such as some of the headlines we see here from the Washington Post and others, point to the growing trend that this colleges they want to see a score. They're deeming it to be very important, and that seems to be accelerating.
Yeah, it's true. And it first started out with just the Ivy League saying we need another data point. But often what happens is that will trickle down to other schools too. And that's what we've seen. So let's take a look at that test optional policy and what really is test optional, because it can be so confusing. All right, so on the left, we have schools that are black and white and ones that are on the right. But what you will see is that some schools will require the tests. They're test required. Most of the Ivy League schools also, often states will say, like, all of our public universities require the test, like all the schools in Florida. Congratulations, the University of Florida last night, and all the Georgia public schools. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have colleges that are test blind. And these are schools that say, you know what, we don't care about your score. Even if you submit it to us, we're not looking at it. We're going to just take into account everything else. And then in the middle, you have two categories of test optional schools. Ones that say they're test optional, outward facing, but really they're test preferred. They prefer it if you submit a test score. They want another data point, and it's a big factor in their admissions. For example, Virginia Tech, Auburn, Boston College, and University of Virginia, we see that far and away, the students getting accepted and enrolled in those schools have submitted a test score. But then we have schools that are really test optional, meaning like if you submit a test score, fabulous. And if you don't, it's not held against you. Ball State, JMU, Mary Washington are examples of those. But what we're seeing is that the growing trend is that schools are going to test preferred. They really do want to see a test score because there is so much grade inflation these days. It is another measure of how you're doing that's not influenced by anything else. And so that's the trend, and we expect that to continue on as we go along. Pete, what are your takeaways from this movement?
I think the growing trend, I mean, I think it underscores the importance of you want to try and get your very best score. You're probably going to need it. So it's a good idea to have it and perhaps not need it than to be in the other position where you wish you had. Especially with so much gray area in there, those schools that say that they're outwardly facing test optional, but in their kind of like in their public statements, consider it to be very important. I think the reality is that you want to prep for your best score so that you can strategically use it as part of your application.
Yeah, we're
decision.
going to talk about that in a second too. So thank you for Pete for that. And I think it's also interesting and important to note because a lot of parents have questions about this, like which test does UVA want, for example, or which test would Georgia Tech like to see? And the answer is that schools honestly do not play favorites with tests. Every school that will look at your test score accepts both the SAT and the ACT, and they do not have a favorite. So when it comes to those tests, Pete, let's talk about the current differences between the SAT and ACT. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the SAT, I would describe it this way. The SAT, I feel like, is the harder test. It is the power test. The ACT, I feel like, is a more curriculum-based test and is easier in that sense. But it's the faster test. You have to move through it faster. The SAT has a heavy concentration on higher math. The ACT doesn't quite reach that level of difficulty in math. They're both challenging tests, but I think the key difference is on the ACT, you have to keep moving. The SAT is there's more time, but it's harder. So that's kind of like that's the flavor, the main flavor of those two.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you. The current version, it's you really got to go at a fast clip on the ACT to get it done. And the ACT is also interesting because the SAT, it has two sections. It's super clear cut. It's reading and writing and math. So math is half of the test. But on the ACT, there's actually four sections. Tell us about those.
Yeah, the ACT it tests four different subjects, and they go in this order: English, math, reading, and science. You'll notice that the SAT doesn't have a science section, but the ACT has a dedicated science section. The ACT on the reading, I'll point this out. They're full essays, like a like a full article. Where on the SAT, they're short paragraphs or poems. They're dense, but they're relatively brief against like a full length essay that's offered on the ACT. And then there's only one section, like you mentioned, there's only one section of math on the ACT, so it only accounts for 1/4 of the overall score, whereas on the SAT it accounts for half the score. So that's an important difference right there. And the dedicated science section on the ACT, where the student has to interpret charts, graphs, tables, and figures, is something that the SAT doesn't offer.
I know you mentioned to me that parts of the ACT are a lot more coachable. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. On the ACT, I think you have two or three sections that are definitely coachable. English is governed by the rules of grammar and punctuation. That's something that can be learned and operates within a narrow band. Math is governed by formulas, so you can pick that up. And then science, you can definitely coach a student with that to help them pick out data points from a chart, graph, or a table and answer questions about them. So there's three subjects right there where I think you could apply strategies and methods. On the SAT, since there's only two subjects, it's harder to do. It's not impossible, of course. There are ways of helping with that test, but there's more of that. There's more of that opportunity on the ACT.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of kids have seen that too. Like, wow, my science section really went up a lot because it could, oftentimes kids come to the test thinking, is this chemistry or biology or physics? And it's not. Like you said, it's charts
Right.
and of that
Data.
information.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so with the ACT, just like what happened with the SAT, where a few years ago they announced, all right, we're going to a digital format and it's going to be adaptive. The ACT in turn has said, wait a second, because a lot of kids shifted to the to the SAT then,
SAT.
right? Because it was shorter, kids like that. And they like the digital format. So the ACT came along and said, oh, wait, we're changing too. And they recently announced these changes. And I'm wondering, Pete, if you can walk us through what's going to happen on this test.
Yeah, it's becoming a shorter test too. Right, the current, and it's been this way for a long time. It's about 3 hours, 2 hours and 55 minutes. So now it's going to be just like the SAT, pretty much a 2 hour test, and just a little bit past it. So that's a big difference. That takes away 40 to 50 minutes of it's almost like a marathon. Now it's a now it's a shorter test. In addition to that, there'll be fewer questions and more time per. So that's a big change and will hopefully play to students' advantage in it. And further, the science section, which you and I were just talking about, is going to become optional. So the composite score will be only averaged out of the three other subjects, English, math, reading, if the student elects to go science optional. I suspect many students will. So then there's an entire section that's like, that's, you don't have to take that. It'll become an option. This is all going to roll out in September of 2025, just a few months away. So it's coming down the pike. And currently, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but they don't have like a full practice test version of this new blueprint that I just described. But those are the changes. Those are the kind of like big picture changes that are happening to the ACT.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pete. And I agree, like that no practice test issue is a real problem for the ACT because kids are like, oh, I like the ACT. It's more straightforward. It's kind of like school. I'll go for that test. But we don't have any practice materials right now, and we'll talk about that again. So thinking about, many parents ask, okay, thanks for this, but like, tell me about a plan for my child. When should they start to prepare? Because we know that, even if your child, you think, okay, my child's not a good test taker, they're just going to apply to test optional schools. The reality is that if they have a balanced list, which they should, and if they're applying to a decent amount of schools, which they should, there are likely going to be schools on their list, maybe not their reach schools, but probably their target or most likely, where submitting a test can really help them. And so they want to know, all right, if my child does do prep, how long should it take? And so for students, we recommend that if you've completed Algebra 2 or higher by the end of 10th grade, you should start prepping over the summer, between your 10th grade year and your 11th grade year. That's what really makes sense. And the reason the summer is super helpful is you don't have all the demands of school. You're a little bit more relaxed and you can focus on test preparation. And then you can aim for a fall test, or, if you wanted to take a winter test or even a spring test and get everything done your junior year. And boy, does that feel great. And we recommend it. That's really a great plan. But for kids that are not going to take Algebra 2 until 11th grade, they should be taking their first test in the spring of their junior year. And they can also take tests in the summer and in the fall. But if for those of you, I saw a couple of seniors when I first asked, what grade is your student in? It is not too late at all. These kids can start prepping now. They can prep through the summer. They can take a late summer test and they can take an early fall test if they want to. And the thing that's great about an early fall test your senior year is that you can still submit that score in time for early action or early decision. Pete, I'm wondering if you can talk about what you're noticing trends and when kids start to prepare.
Yeah, it used to be that students and families would reach me more like in the fall, like to start to get serious about it in September or October and say, hey, it's like, what should we do? Is this the time? That kind of used to be kind of like the pattern. Now it feels like everybody's getting to it earlier, which is probably wise. But that is what I've noticed is becoming the growing trend is this question is popping up earlier. And should I be starting now? Like the question surfacing like in May or June. So and as you just said, I mean, that leads kind of like the idea of like maybe the summer's a good time to work on it. That's what I'm noticing is that it's like that fall kind of like starting point is moving earlier on the along the timeline.
I've seen that too, Pete, and it makes sense for sure. All right, so we made it a little bit easy for everybody, and we put it together in a chart for you so that you can see, depending on when you've selected, and by the way, we're super happy to help you with this, determining your test prep timeline. You can see here the official dates, and then when to start prep. We generally recommend you're starting to prep 2 to 5 months before your very first test. So you would prep up to the first test, get the score back, prep again, leading up to the second test. Typically, kids are going to take the test 2 or 3 times. And the reason for that is obviously you get acclimated to the test, you feel more comfortable. When you're more comfortable, you tend to score better. And then your scores can be super scored, which we'll also talk about in a moment. But here you can see your timeline for when to start prep. So let's dig deeper into how your child should strategize about this depending on their grade level. So if your student is a current junior, I saw a lot of juniors on this call today, you should really have your remaining test prep dates planned out. But if you don't, that's okay. Because if your child has maybe taken a test already, but they're not completely happy with their score, they can absolutely take it again this summer and in the fall. I would recommend that if your child's going to take it again in the summer, instead of finishing school and not doing anything up to that test date, because they're not in school, they're not around curriculum, they're not around critical thinking, that they absolutely prep for it before they take it again, especially over the summer, and they can take it again in the fall. And as I mentioned, they still have time to apply early action and early decision. But if you're a sophomore, you are in this very, very unique situation. It's also a temporary situation. But as we mentioned, the ACT is in a state of change, and there are not official test prep materials out there. So what we're recommending is that kids go with the SAT right now. And many kids they're saying, you know what, I like the ACT, but it's kind of unknown. Let me stick with the SAT until more information comes out. And so that's what many students are doing. And again, take advantage of the summer months as you prep. And then if you're a freshman, and I saw some parents of freshmen here too, you really have plenty of time. It is not, you don't want your child to sit for a regular test right now, because if they do, the score they're going to get is likely to be really deflated, and it makes them feel not so great about their prospects. So we recommend for freshmen, don't worry about it right now. Focus on your grades, do the best you can. And then after your sophomore year or late in your sophomore year, think about prepping at that point. So you have plenty of time if you're a freshman. Pete, anything to add about the strategy?
Yeah, what I'd like to add, there's a lot of people might be thinking, and I think it's like this would be a normal thought. Well, as a practice test, why wouldn't I take both? I would take an SAT, an ACT, and then kind of determine like what works for me, what I like. Do I like the style? How's my score? Ordinarily, that would be the way to go. We're just in a slightly kind of like unique pickle right now, where if you thought that's like, well, let me try and take both and make a decision. The ACT is kind of like unsettled right now in order to make that decision. So, so that's why we're saying the essay for your practice test. You're getting to know these tests. You start with the SAT through the College Board's app. You can take it a full, legitimate SAT, get a score, see how it feels, the timing, the content, and that would be our starting point for now. This is all going to straighten out over time, but that's why we're saying that right now is start with the SAT, see how that feels. If you do it and say, wow, I kind of didn't like that. I mean, the math was way hard. I didn't like reading those poems from 1689. It's like, then, if you patiently wait, we're going to get to the ACT. So then you could do that apples to apples comparison. That's exactly why we're recommending what we're saying right now.
And Pete, I was also going to mention that sometimes students will say, well, could I take the current ACT now and then take the new one in the fall? And the answer is absolutely. You can totally do that. And the ACT will likely super score those scores. It's not on their websites that says, yes, we will definitely do that. But we're thinking based on other communications that they will super score those scores.
Yeah, you could totally do that. you could take like the test the way it is now with the 4 sections and 2 hours and 55 minutes. There's nothing that would preclude you from doing that. The problem is that we don't know what the scale, how will they scale the shorter test? How are they going to measure and make the curve when there's fewer sections, fewer questions, more time per? Is it's You won't be able to get like what are they going to say the score is? But of course, you could practice the test the way it is, and that's not a bad thing to do.
For sure. So let's talk about the role of super scoring. So super scoring is when you take the test, you have to take it multiple times to come up with your optimal score. So Pete, tell us about this.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify upon that. The dominant trend is that students are going to take the test 2 or 3 times. That's by far most students almost all of the time. Since you're doing that, you're going to have multiple scores available, especially on the ACT, and this happens on the SAT too, with their 2 main subjects, reading and writing and math. But what the super score allows the student to do is to take your very best English, your very best math out of the 2 or 3 times that you've taken it, and then that becomes part of the composite. So on one test, you might have had a great math day. On another test, you had a great English day, or a very good science. The super score blends the highest subject scores so that you get your your composite score. And the ACT and SAT both do this, and all of the colleges accept it. I think there are a couple of, you always check with your college, but I mean, this is almost universally accepted now. The blending of the scores across all of the subjects.
And parents often ask, well, do I have to do that? How does that work? And the answer is when colleges get your scores, for the vast majority of colleges, they're already super scored. So when they pull up your application, they'll see a banner that has your test scores at the top, and those will be super scored test scores. And it can make a huge difference. Like in this example, all right, your last score, you got a 21, but your super score is a 23. There's actually a big difference between a 23 and a 21. And that's why super.
Absolutely, it's yeah, it sounds modest, but I mean, or maybe even think, wow, it's trivial, like 1 point, 2 points, but that can lead to a lot of opportunities to open up your funnel of colleges that you can apply to that will accept you, and financial assistance too.
That's absolutely true. We didn't touch on that, Pete, but really for many schools, when they're considering aid, especially merit aid, they're looking at test scores as well for different scholarships. So certainly a consideration. All right, so I'd love to go to Q&A in just a second. So if you have a question, please, instead of putting it in the chat, put it in the Q&A section, and I'm going to bring Melissa in just a moment, and we're going to answer some of your questions. But I wanted to just touch on the strategy. Pete, it used to be that kids would show up for a test and take the test, and if they didn't love their score, they'd take it again. But that is out the window now. It is far, far more strategic when it comes to test preparation and which, how do I know which colleges I should submit my test scores? So we see that it's really a two-pronged approach. First, it's that your child needs a strategy, that they really shouldn't go into this blind, and we're happy to help. One of the first things we do when parents are considering test preparation is they talk to one of our program managers who, and by the way, you can scan this QR code, or you can go to our website at ectutoring.com. I think Melissa also put it in the chat, and you can set up an appointment. It's completely free, and it's about 15, 20 minutes where we'll talk to you about your child, their grades, their, everything that's going on in their academic history and what they're looking at now in terms of colleges, and help you create a plan for your timeline and what you're going to do for test preparation. So we do that first, and then if you decide to get test prep, that's when one of our coaches, like Pete, comes in and will work one-to-one with you about your child, so that they're getting the best scores they can and strategizing as to where to use those scores when they're applying to college. But what we found, and Pete, I'm hoping you can talk more about this, is that really the best results are going to come, score increases, when kids work one-to-one with a tutor. When we first started out, we did small groups, and after about 2 years, we completely stopped doing them because we found that the results were not like it was with one-to-one. Pete, I'm wondering if you can talk about what sessions look like for you and for all the other coaches.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like one-to-one is the gold standard. Like you, I've taught with in small groups and larger settings. I think there's a tendency for the students to be able to kind of like hide in the shadows when there's others, you know. But when it's you, like it's I'm meeting you and it's one-on-one, I'm holding you responsible. I mean, this is your dedicated time. So that it lends kind of like it forces a discipline upon everybody involved. You know, you have to do the homework. I'm going to ask you about that. You're, you know, these are you can, and I always tell students you can ask your questions your way. You don't have to worry that there's a bunch of other people and it's like, oh, I'm reluctant to ask the question. The other thing too is we're looking at what you need. Every student's different. I'll look at your practice test. We'll look at your score report and say where are the opportunities? Is it the math that you need? Is it grammar and punctuation on the SAT? What they call the standard of English conventions. I noticed that wow, that's kind of like lower than the rest. We're going to come up with your priorities. Each student's priorities are different, so we'll come up with a hierarchy of what you need. You can't do that outside of a one-to-one setting. I feel like it has to be so that you get what you need out of it. I also insist on using official practice test documents in one-on-one tutoring. We provide feedback after every session as to how it's going, what you got right, what you got wrong, the percentages. So there's kind of like an ongoing dialogue. All of this lends responsibility to everybody involved, and it's the one-on-one structure and environment that fosters all of that.
Yeah, I was at a party. This was I don't know, maybe it was more than a few months back. And this parent said to me, who used our services, said, "Oh, my daughter hemmed and hawed. She thought she could do this on her own. She did not want to tutor. No way, no how." And afterwards, she had such a great experience and really improved her score and said, "Oh my gosh, thank you for making me do that." So sometimes kids come to us reluctantly, but it always ends up to be a positive thing. So thanks for sharing that. So thank you for being my guest, Pete. It was great to see all of
Thank you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I wish you the very best for the remainder of the school year and your entire test prep journey. We'll follow up with a recording tomorrow and look for that in your email. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Bye-bye.